guests stood frozen among the roses, staring at Adrian Fawcett's body as though it might rise and explain itself. Yet the only movement came from the lanterns swaying overhead, casting thin, tremulous shadows across his still face. Miss Marple reached the edge of the small crowd and paused, taking in the scene with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the rising panic around her. She heard Mrs. Harcourt breathing rapidly, heard someone whisper that it must have been a fainting spell, heard Inspector Flint mutter something about everyone stepping back. But Miss Marple knew a fainting spell did not twist a man's head so unnaturally, nor render his complexion that peculiar shade that suggested life had fled some minutes earlier. Dr. Vale pushed through the throng, dropping to one knee beside the body. His earlier flush had faded, replaced by a clinical focus that Miss Marple had always considered his best attribute. He touched Fawcett's throat, then his wrist, then gently examined the angle of his head. "No pulse," he announced, though the declaration was hardly necessary. "Neck injury. Severe. Instant, most likely." Mrs. Harcourt let out a sound between a sob and a gasp. Neck injury? But how could that happen? He was just walking. Oh, dear heavens, what will people say? Inspector Flint straightened, his expression grim but already settling into a familiar firmness. "Everyone step away. Dr. Vale, don't move him. No one touches anything." He surveyed the narrow gravel path, the hedges on either side, the faint indentations in the stones. "Looks like a fall," he said. "Slipped on the gravel, perhaps. Struck his head or neck on the edge of the stone border." Dr. Vale hesitated. "He could have fallen, yes, though it would require considerable force. And the ground isn't steep." Miss Marple noticed the way Flint's eyes narrowed just slightly. He disliked complications. "Fell," the inspector repeated, as though confirming it to himself. "Most likely. Simple accident." There was a murmur among the guests. The word accident fluttered through them like a relieving breeze. People disliked the notion of violence intruding upon polite company. They preferred missteps, unfortunate chances, even clumsiness to any suggestion of deliberate harm. But Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the rose hedge, to the slight disturbance of leaves, to the small patch of scuffed gravel not far from the body, as though someone had pivoted sharply or braced themselves. Accidents had signatures. So did other things. Lucy Harcourt appeared then, pale as moonlight and trembling visibly. She had been the one to scream, Miss Marple recalled. The girl's hands were clasped tightly before her, fingers white at the knuckles. She stared at Fawcett with a mixture of shock and something else. Fear, certainly, but of what kind? Miss Marple watched her carefully, noting the way Lucy's gaze flicked toward the hedges before returning quickly to the body. "Lucy," Mrs. Harcourt cried, rushing to her niece. "My dear girl, are you quite all right? Sit down. You're shaking." I found him," Lucy managed. "I only stepped into the garden for a moment. He was lying there already. I didn't see anyone else. I thought he might still be alive." Inspector Flint approached her, softening his tone. "Miss Harcourt, did you notice anything unusual? Anyone running, perhaps? Any sign of a struggle?" Lucy shook her head too quickly. "No, nothing. I only saw him like that." Miss Marple, watching from a pace away, felt the same faint stirring of intuition she often experienced when someone's account aligned too perfectly with what they wished to be believed. Fear made people honest at times, but it also made them rehearsed. Flint seemed satisfied, however. "We'll need statements from everyone. But for now, return to the house. All of you. Dr. Vale, stay here with me until the constable arrives." Guests began drifting back toward the terrace, subdued and murmuring. The orchestra had gone silent. The fairy lights now appeared oddly harsh against the darkness, as though they illuminated too much and too little at once. Miss Marple lingered near the edge of the path. She had no desire to obstruct the official investigation. Inspector Flint was always rather prickly when he felt she was interfering. But she allowed herself a thoughtful look at the small details. Fawcett's shoes, one slightly scuffed, the faint, crushed impression of roses leaning outward, the small glint of something metallic, half hidden beneath a petal. She leaned subtly, just enough to glimpse it. A button, black, smooth, decorative. Not Fawcett's. His coat had gleaming silver ones. She said nothing. Not yet. Instead, she turned as Lucy passed near her, guided by Mrs. Harcourt. The girl's breathing was unsteady, her face drawn. Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. Terrible shock for you, my dear. Do take care. Sudden encounters with tragedy can unsettle one, dreadfully. Lucy gave a weak, distracted nod. Yes, of course. But her eyes would not meet Miss Marple's. As the group ascended the steps, the night seemed to gather closer. The gala, which had promised enchantment, now felt hollow, its gaiety extinguished in an instant. Miss Marple walked slowly behind the others, reflecting on the contrasts such events revealed. People behaved differently under lanterns and evening gowns. They whispered secrets more readily, feared things more urgently. At the terrace, Mrs. Harcourt declared the gala ended in a trembling voice. Guests fetched coats, murmured condolences, and slipped away into the night. Inspector Flint remained in the garden, pacing. Miss Marple paused before stepping into the manor. As she listened to the soft hum of panicked conversation around her, a thought settled gently, unmistakably into place. An accident was a comforting explanation. But comfort had never been a reliable measure of truth. The manor's drawing room had taken on an atmosphere of strained civility, as though everyone inside were trying to behave as they might at the tail end of a polite evening, despite the unmistakable tension that clung to the air like smoke. Mrs. Harcourt insisted that those still present should compose themselves with a warm drink. But the offer did little good. Hands shook too visibly, voices wavered, and the room felt crowded even with only a dozen or so guests remaining. Miss Marple sat in a small armchair near the fireplace, the steam from her untouched teacup curling gently upward. She appeared to be resting. Indeed, many forgot she was there. But her eyes moved quietly, noting the telling gestures, the little glances, the unguarded tremors. Lucy sat on a chaise near the window, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Mrs. Harcourt hovered anxiously beside her, patting her hand every few minutes. Lucy murmured reassurances, though her voice lacked conviction. She kept her gaze low, as though afraid the room might demand something of her that she was unprepared to give. Miss Marple noticed that the girl's dress was slightly crumpled at the waist, as if she had been gripped there by a strong hand. It was the kind of detail that might have been accidental, but rarely was. Dr. Vale entered first from the terrace doors, brushing off the last of the night air. His expression remained composed, but there was a heaviness in his step now, as though the weight of his professional obligations pressed harder than usual. "Inspector Flint asked me to let you know," he said to the room, "that the constable has arrived. They'll transport the—" He hesitated, then corrected himself. "They'll see to Mr. Fawcett shortly." A few guests winced at the bluntness, but others seemed relieved simply to be informed. Miss Marple watched Dr. Vale carefully as he continued across the room and accepted a cup of tea. The doctor's face was too grave, too reflective, and Miss Marple found herself wondering if he had seen something else, something he had not yet deemed appropriate to mention. Inspector Flint came in a moment later, his coat removed, sleeves rolled up, and expression clipped. He looked as though the night had given him more work than he approved of. "I'll need statements from those who were nearest the rose garden," he announced, "and no one is to leave until I've finished. We don't want confusion." His glance swept the room, lingering momentarily on Lucy, then shifting away. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to her tea to avoid meeting his. Flint did not appreciate interference, yet she had often found his definition of interference rather broad. Still, tonight she was careful. One mustn't prod a man already irritated. Across the room, Mr. Giles Whittaker, a mild-mannered solicitor with an unfortunate tendency to stammer when nervous, cleared his throat. "Inspector, if if one were to speculate, could the gentleman perhaps have suffered a collapse? A condition, maybe. Some weakness unknown to us." His gaze darted apologetically around the room as if afraid he had said something improper. Flint folded his arms. "The doctor will give whatever medical insight is necessary. Until then, I won't confirm anything." But his tone suggested that, yes, he still preferred the idea of an accident. It would have been simpler and far less troublesome for the village. Miss Marple noticed that Lucy's breathing quickened slightly at Whittaker's suggestion, not in relief, but in heightened tension. It was as though the mere mention of a natural cause unsettled her more than the alternative. Fascinating. Dr. Vale took a measured sip of tea before speaking. "From what I can tell, Mr. Fawcett was a healthy man. No signs of cardiac distress or collapse. His neck—" He paused when Mrs. Harcourt flinched. His injury was consistent with sudden, forceful impact. It might have been a fall, yes, but the angle was unfortunate. Miss Marple's fingers curled lightly around the handle of her teacup, though she still did not drink it. Flint shot Vale a look. He disliked ambiguity even more than he disliked Miss Marple's quiet observations. From the far end of the room, Mrs. Pennington, who had always thrived on village crises, whispered to her friend, but what was he even doing in the rose garden at that hour? She had not meant to be overheard, but her voice carried just enough. "And that poor girl finding him, oh, the trauma!" Lucy's shoulders tensed. Miss Marple saw it. Flint saw it too, though with far less subtlety. He approached Lucy, pulling up a stiff wooden chair before her. Mrs. Harcourt hovered protectively but didn't interfere. "Miss Harcourt," Flint said, "you told us you went into the garden alone. Why was that?" Lucy's hands clenched the shawl. "I needed a moment. The gala was overwhelming. I just wanted fresh air." "And Mr. Fawcett?" Flint asked. "Did you see him enter the garden before you?" Her breath caught almost imperceptibly, but she shook her head. "No, I didn't." Miss Marple noted the nuance. She had answered quickly, too quickly, as if a slower response might allow the truth to slip out. Flint rubbed his chin. "Did you and Mr. Fawcett know each other well?" Color rose in Lucy's cheeks, a fragile blush, born not of embarrassment, but of fear. "We spoke a few times since he arrived. Nothing more." Nothing more. It was a phrase Miss Marple had encountered often enough to recognize its hollowness. People rarely confessed their entanglements in drawing rooms full of listening ears. They preferred to smooth their stories into manageable shapes, much like villagers flattening creases in a tablecloth before tea. Before Flint could press further, Mrs. Harcourt interjected, "Inspector, really, my niece has suffered enough for one evening." Flint exhaled sharply but relented. He turned away, and the room relaxed slightly. But Miss Marple, watching Lucy rub her thumb anxiously over the pearl bracelet she wore, felt certain the girl had not yet told the whole truth. The constable arrived shortly after, visible through the terraced doors. Flint excused himself, leaving temporary silence behind him. Miss Marple used that quiet to stand, smoothing her skirt. She did not approach Lucy directly. Instead, she crossed to Dr. Vale, who looked lost in thought. "A troubling night, Doctor," she said gently. He nodded. "Quite troubling. And the nature of Mr. Fawcett's injury. Unusual for a simple fall, wouldn't you say?" Vale's eyes flicked to hers. He hesitated, weighing propriety against honesty. "Yes," he murmured. "Unusual indeed." Miss Marple gave a soft nod. "I rather thought so." And though she said no more, That small acknowledgement settled something in her mind. Not a conclusion, not yet, but the shape of a pattern beginning to emerge, delicate as a thread and just as easy to miss. The atmosphere in the drawing room shifted as Inspector Flint stepped out to confer with the constable, leaving behind a brittle silence that seemed to hover over every polished surface. Miss Marple remained beside Dr. Vale for a moment longer, watching the way his gaze drifted toward the terrace doors, as though replaying the scene in the rose garden. He was a thoughtful man, reflective in a way that often made others mistake him for hesitant. But Miss Marple knew he was weighing what he had seen against what he ought to say. Before she could speak again, Mrs. Pennington drifted nearer, her voice lowered to a confidential murmur. "Doctor, you observed the body more closely than anyone. You must have some idea of what happened. A man doesn't simply collapse in such a dreadful fashion." Her eyes sparkled with a hunger for drama that Miss Marple had often found rather unkind. Dr. Vale stiffened. "Mrs. Pennington, I've already said what I can. Speculation is unhelpful." "Unhelpful, perhaps, but people will speculate all the same." She gave a pointed glance toward the nervous cluster of guests at the far end of the room. "I dare say some already are." Miss Marple noticed Lucy flinch subtly at the comment. She wasn't meant to hear it, of course. The careless whispers of villagers often reached farther than intended. Mrs. Harcourt placed a protective arm around her niece, glaring at the gossip-minded woman with a ferocity rarely seen in her otherwise cheerful expression. But Mrs. Pennington merely offered a thin smile and wandered off to join another group of murmuring neighbors. Miss Marple leaned toward Dr. Vale and spoke softly. "People often fear what they fail to understand, and that fear makes them careless with words." Dr. Vale's shoulders seemed to loosen a fraction. "She means no harm," he said, though without conviction. Miss Marple gave him a gentle look. Intentions are rarely as harmless as people imagine. As they spoke, the drawing-room door opened again and Inspector Flint re-entered, brushing rain from his sleeves. A light drizzle had begun outside, the kind that pattered delicately against the terrace windows. He cleared his throat loudly, bringing attention back to himself with a practiced authority. "Right," he announced. "Statements will be taken in the library. I'll speak with each of you in turn. Please remain available." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, prepared to be dismissed as a harmless old woman. Flint's gaze swept over the room until it landed on Lucy once more. The girl stiffened visibly. "I'll begin with Miss Harcourt," Flint said. Mrs. Harcourt gasped. "Inspector, she's barely recovered. She's the only witness to finding the body. Her statement is essential." Lucy rose shakily, her face the pallor of cold marble. Mrs. Harcourt supported her as they crossed toward the library door. Miss Marple watched them go, observing every faint tremor, every downcast glance. Lucy's reluctance to speak might have been natural shock, but Miss Marple sensed something more carefully guarded beneath the surface. As the door shut behind them, the guests resumed their uneasy conversations. Dr. Vale retreated to the fireplace, staring deeply into the flames. Miss Marple considered joining him, but instead drifted toward the refreshment table, where a nearly empty tray of eclairs sat. The pastries, so proudly presented at the start of the evening, now seemed oddly out of place, symbols of festivity in a room hollowed by fear. She picked one up, not to eat, but to examine. The eclair had been smudged slightly at one end, as though handled carelessly. A trivial detail, perhaps, and yet trivialities often exposed interesting truths. Mr. Giles Whittaker approached her hesitantly, wringing his hands. "Miss Marple," he said in a strained whisper. "A dreadful night, isn't it? I can't recall a village event disrupted so terribly." Miss Marple offered him a kindly nod. "Tragedy has a way of catching people unprepared, Mr. Whittaker. You are troubled?" "Yes. Yes, indeed." He leaned closer, almost conspiratorial. I couldn't help noticing earlier that Mr. Fawcett seemed engaged in a rather intense conversation near the terrace. With Miss Harcourt, I believe. Miss Marple kept her tone mild. Did you observe anything particular? Well, only that she appeared distressed, quite pale, and he seemed insistent. Whitaker swallowed nervously. It may mean nothing, of course. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Or it may mean something. Thank you for telling me. He nodded, relieved simply to have shared the burden, and scuttled away. The library door opened then, and Lucy emerged looking even more fragile than before. Mrs. Harcourt clutched her arm protectively. Inspector Flint followed, his face unreadable but set with stubborn determination. "Dr. Vale," Flint called. "You're next." The doctor nodded and disappeared into the library. Flint closed the door behind them, leaving the drawing room once again steeped in quiet murmurs. Miss Marple crossed the room toward Lucy, who had sunk onto the chaise once more. Mrs. Harcourt tried to keep her niece shielded, but Lucy lifted her head at Miss Marple's approach, her eyes wide with unspoken fear. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "it is a hard thing, being the one to find someone in such a state. You mustn't blame yourself." Lucy's voice trembled. "I didn't know what to do. I simply screamed." That would be expected. Most people would. Lucy bit her lip. Do you think the inspector believes that I know more than I'm saying?" Miss Marple offered a soft, sympathetic smile. "Inspector Flint believes whatever seems most straightforward at any moment. But I've always found life, not to mention human nature, far more complicated." Lucy's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. "I hardly knew Mr. Fawcett," she whispered, too quickly again. Miss Marple reached out, touching her hand in a gesture both comforting and carefully observant. "Sometimes, my dear, the things we say the fastest are the things we most wish were true." Lucy inhaled sharply, but before she could reply, the library door opened again and Dr. Vale stepped out, his face drawn. Flint looked next toward Miss Marple. She knew the inspector did not truly need a statement from her at this early stage, but she also knew he would not want to appear negligent. So she rose calmly, smoothing her skirt once more, and offered Lucy a reassuring nod. "Don't fret, my dear," she murmured. "It is only a conversation." Yet as she stepped into the library, Miss Marple carried with her the certainty that Adrian Fawcett's death was no accident, and that the web surrounding it was tightening with each passing moment. The corridor stretched ahead of them in a dim, breathless hush, its walls pulsing faintly with the same dull amber glow that had flickered beneath the floorboards of the farmhouse. Elena kept her flashlight low, its beam cutting a narrow path through the dust-heavy air, while Marcus trailed a few steps behind, notebook in one hand, the other brushing lightly against the wall's uneven surface. He didn't want to touch it, but he couldn't resist confirming what he already suspected, that the faint warmth radiating from the underground passage wasn't mechanical. It felt more like the slow throb of something organic, something that had been dormant far longer than any of them wanted to consider. The hum remained soft, tucked beneath the scuff of their boots, but it grew steadier the farther they moved, as though responding to their presence. Elena noticed it too. She slowed, raising her hand for silence, her breath forming a thin mist in the cooler stretch of air ahead. The sudden temperature shift was unmistakable, and it hardened her already tense posture. The farmhouse above had been warm, even stifling in places, yet this depth felt carved from a deep cavern untouched by sunlight. "It's getting colder," Marcus whispered, though she didn't need him to say it. She nodded, directing the flashlight toward a bend in the passage. They'd already traveled farther than the ground-penetrating radar had suggested the tunnel extended, and the increasingly unnatural sensations only deepened her suspicion that the structure wasn't built by any known occupants of the land. When they reached the bend, Helena pressed her shoulder against the inner wall and sidestepped around the curve, careful to keep her silhouette small. Her flashlight revealed a broader chamber ahead, its ceiling lost in shadow, and something else. Thin strands stretched between the walls like brittle webbing. They weren't spider silk. The strands were thicker, faintly metallic, vibrating gently as though stirred by the vibrations of the earth far above. Marcus exhaled shakily. This wasn't in the scans. Elena moved forward, examining the strands. They seemed rooted in the stone, but the stone itself looked carved rather than naturally formed. She traced her light along a series of repeating notches that spiraled outward, creating patterns too precise to be accidental. Someone, or something, built this, she murmured. Marcus crouched beside one of the anchored strands, squinting as he scribbled notes. The orientation lines up with the angles we saw on the tablet fragments, he said, voice tight with realization. That connection struck Elena immediately. They hadn't mentioned the fragments since the farmhouse, but the etched symbols had haunted her thoughts even as they descended. If this chamber shared visual similarities, it meant the objects above ground were only surface clues to something far older. She stepped further inside, her boots stirring dust that had lain untouched for centuries. The chamber was silent, oppressive, like an underwater cavern starved of light and movement. Yet something about its symmetry made her feel watched, as though the room itself evaluated their intrusion. Marcus stood and directed his own flashlight toward the far wall, where the strands converged into a single thickened knot, embedded within a large stone formation. At first, Elena thought it was simply a pillar, but the longer she observed it, the more it resembled a sealed doorway, one with no hinges or visible seams. The knot pulsed faintly, catching her eye with its subtle shift from amber to a deeper, almost bruised violet. She approached cautiously, resisting the urge to touch it. "It's reacting," Marcus whispered behind her, and she heard the audible swallow in his throat. She didn't respond immediately. Her instincts screamed caution, but they also urged her to understand what lay behind the sealed stone. Every clue so far had hinted at something buried deliberately, meant to be hidden rather than lost. She stepped around the formation, illuminating its edges. The symbols etched along its base were the same style as the tablet. Sharp, angular, carved with a deliberate rhythm that echoed meaning even without translation. Marcus moved closer to inspect them, but before he reached the base, a faint tremor rippled across the chamber floor. Elena froze. The strands quivered, humming in resonance, and for an instant the entire room seemed to inhale. Then the violet glow surged, brightening just enough to reveal something neither of them expected. A thin fissure tracing the center of the stone doorway, like a wound beginning to reopen. "Back up," Elena ordered quietly, but her voice carried a tension that betrayed her unease. Marcus stepped away reluctantly, though his eyes remained fixed on the forming crack. The hum deepened, resonating through their chests, and Elena gripped her flashlight harder, preparing for the possibility of a cave-in, or something worse. The fissure widened another fraction of an inch, exhaling a chilled breath of air that carried the scent of old soil and something metallic. Marcus finally tore his gaze away, long enough to meet hers. "If this opens," he said softly, "we'll need to decide fast whether we run or document." Elena didn't hesitate. "We do both," she replied, locking her attention on the glowing seam. "But whatever's in there, whoever buried it didn't want it found." The fissure widened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, as if testing their patience and courage. A soft, resonant hum pulsed from within, vibrating through the stone floor and up into their boots. Marcus swallowed hard, his notebook trembling slightly in his hands. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, voice hushed. Elena's jaw tightened. "Nor have I. But everything here tells me it's deliberate. Someone or something wanted this hidden." She stepped closer, careful to keep her weight balanced on the gravel-like dust beneath their feet. The strands anchored in the walls twitched at her approach, as though aware of her movement, and a thin metallic ringing followed her footsteps. It was subtle, but Miss Marple would have noticed this kind of warning signal, the way things respond to human presence, betraying intent or design. She didn't speak. Instead, she motioned for Marcus to move slightly back, giving her room to examine the knot more closely. The stone was cold to the touch, unnaturally smooth, but the fissure itself seemed to pulse with faint warmth. Tiny particles of dust floated upward in the light of her flashlight, suspended as though caught in invisible currents. She traced the edge with her fingertip, noting the rhythmic indentation of the carvings. Symbols, repeated in a sequence that suggested both instruction and warning. "These marks," she murmured, more to herself than Marcus. "They're not just decoration, they're communication." Marcus leaned closer, eyes wide, flashlight illuminating the carvings. "Instruction? Warning?" he asked, breath hitching. Elena's lips pressed together. Perhaps both. Whoever designed this wanted anyone approaching to understand, and yet also to fear. Another tremor coursed through the chamber, stronger this time, making the strands vibrate visibly. Marcus stumbled backward, nearly tripping, and Elena caught him lightly by the arm. The stone fissure widened again, a thin shaft of violet light seeping through the gap. It was not a bright illumination, but enough to reveal movement behind the door, a subtle shift in shadows that suggested depth beyond what they could see. Marcus's hands shook, and his notebook nearly fell. "We should step back," he said hurriedly, but Elena raised a finger, quieting him. "Not yet. I need to see it." She adjusted her flashlight, angling it through the narrow gap. A chill gust of air escaped, carrying the scent of soil, metal, and something faintly acrid. The vibration intensified, now pulsing in time with their own quickened heartbeats. The stones seemed to respond to them, to the presence of living creatures on its threshold. Elena inhaled steadily, keeping her own fear in check. She had faced discoveries before that unsettled ordinary men, and she knew instinctively that retreat now would mean losing the first insight into whatever lay beyond. Marcus, pale but obedient, stepped to her side, keeping a careful distance. They watched as the fissure widened just enough for the smallest portion of the chamber beyond to be revealed. Shadows shifted along the rough walls, and the floor inside seemed to slope downward slightly, drawing their gaze into a narrow passage. A faint glimmer caught Elena's eye, tiny, irregular flashes of light reflecting off the walls like distant stars. She noted the irregular pattern, not random, but deliberate. "Something has been here recently," she whispered. Marcus frowned. "You think someone else?" "No," Elena interrupted softly. "Not someone else, not a human, not in the conventional sense. The disturbance is too careful, too precise. Whoever, or whatever it is, knows exactly how to remain hidden while leaving a trace." She knelt slightly, moving the flashlight to reveal the bottom edge of the stone doorway. A small object lay lodged in the crevice, a metallic disc, thin, engraved with Morse symbols like those on the tablets. Elena picked it up with gloved hands, turning it over. The engravings were sharp, angular, and unmistakably similar to those outside. "A marker," she said, voice low. "To show the path, or perhaps to warn." Marcus leaned over to see, eyes narrowing. "A warning?" Elena nodded. "Yes, for those who approach uninvited." They studied the faintly glowing symbols for several minutes, trying to decode meaning from the repetitions. Each pattern suggested direction, rhythm, and caution, yet nothing concrete emerged. The tension in the chamber thickened, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Suddenly, the pulsing light within the fissure brightened for an instant, reflecting on the metallic disc in Elena's hands. A sharp, high-pitched note sounded, subtle but distinct, vibrating through the floor and walls. The strands anchored to the walls twitched violently, nearly brushing against Elena's shoulders. She dropped the disc lightly onto the ground, stepping back instinctively. Marcus mirrored her movement, eyes wide with disbelief. The vibration subsided as quickly as it had come, leaving only the soft hum beneath their feet. "It's alive," Marcus whispered, barely audible. Elena's gaze remained fixed on the fissure. "Not alive in the conventional sense," she replied, "but aware. A construct of design and purpose. Someone or something intended it to respond." They exchanged a long, silent glance, understanding the magnitude of what they had discovered. Nothing about the farmhouse, the tablets, or the carvings had prepared them for this level of hidden complexity. Elena adjusted her flashlight again, shining it directly through the narrowing gap. Shadows shifted beyond, revealing hints of further chambers, passageways, and perhaps secrets that had remained sealed for centuries. The air was thick with anticipation, electric and unrelenting. Elena swallowed, steeling herself. "We continue," she said, voice low but firm. "Slowly, carefully. Every movement matters." Marcus nodded, taking a steadying breath. Together they inched closer to the threshold, knowing that whatever lay beyond the fissure would redefine the limits of their understanding and perhaps their safety. The pulsing hum continued beneath their boots, a subtle reminder that they were no longer merely observers, but participants in a narrative written long before their arrival. And with that realization, Elena took the first deliberate step toward the unknown, the faint glow of violet light spilling onto her determined face. Elena's first step into the passage beyond the fissure was measured and deliberate, her boots stirring only faint clouds of the centuries-old dust that carpeted the stone floor. The narrow gap had widened enough to allow movement, but the walls pressed close, lined with the vibrating strands that seemed almost sentient in their tension. Marcus followed immediately, his notebook clutched against his chest, flashlight beam bouncing nervously along the carved stone surfaces. Each symbol they passed repeated the patterns from the tablets and the doorway, yet here, in the dim confines of the chamber, the sequence felt more deliberate, more urgent. The repetition suggested not just caution, but instruction, as though the tunnel itself was guiding those who dared enter, or perhaps warning them against proceeding further. The violet light pulsed faintly ahead, illuminating the floor in brief flashes that revealed a shallow incline. The air grew cooler and drier, carrying an earthy scent mingled with something faintly metallic, as though the tunnel breathed from deep within the stone. "Do you feel that?" Marcus whispered. Elena nodded. The floor beneath their feet seemed to vibrate in response to their movement, a subtle thrum that was almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable when paying attention. She paused, crouching slightly to inspect a faint pattern etched into the floor. Small grooves formed a sequence of angular shapes, worn with age yet precise. "It's deliberate," she murmured. "These marks are not natural. They're part of the design." Marcus leaned in closer, flashlight illuminating a section that ran parallel to the wall. The grooves mirrored the symbols on the tablets and the metallic disc they had found. "It's like a language," he said, voice low. "One we're not meant to understand easily." Elena ran her gloved fingers along the grooves, careful not to disturb the dust settled in their depths. "Or one we're only beginning to interpret," she replied. They advanced further, the pulse of the floor increasing subtly with each step. The strands along the walls twitched in resonance, brushing lightly against their sleeves and sending shivers down their spines. Elena noted the careful spacing, the measured tension, and the way they responded to their weight and movement. Marcus's hand rested on the wall for balance, but even he noticed the strange sensation. The tunnel itself seemed aware of them. At a slight bend, the passage opened into a larger chamber, the vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, the floor littered with faint debris. The pulse of the light was more pronounced here, and faint glimmers of reflective surfaces caught their flashlight beams. Elena stepped cautiously onto a stone platform at the center. Small fragments of the metallic disc they had found were embedded into the floor, set in a pattern that radiated outward like a deliberate constellation. Marcus knelt to examine them, brushing away dust carefully, revealing angular symbols that echoed the same instructions they had encountered before. "It's like a map," he whispered. "But where to?" Elena observed the room's perimeter. Shadowed recesses suggested corridors branching away, though the layout was irregular, almost organic in its complexity. The pulse of the light now followed a rhythm she recognized, a heartbeat-like pattern, steady and deliberate. "It's alive, in a sense," she murmured. "Not living, but responsive. Everything here is designed to react." Marcus nodded, unease evident on his face. "Do you think it's a trap?" Elena considered this, her fingers brushing along a particularly worn groove that seemed to guide toward a faintly glowing doorway in the far wall. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's merely a warning," she said. "But in this case, the warning is as critical as any trap could be." The violet light brightened as they approached the doorway, revealing more intricate carvings framing its edges. The symbols were denser here, arranged with a precision that suggested importance, though the meaning remained obscure. Elena crouched to examine the base, noting tiny scratches on the stone that suggested prior attempts to move through or manipulate the door. Marcus studied the glow, his eyes narrowing. "Do you think someone or something has been here recently?" he asked. Elena's expression remained calm but focused. "Yes, not in the sense of a visitor passing through casually, but someone with knowledge of these patterns and the intended response. Whoever they are, they knew exactly how to navigate this space without triggering anything overtly harmful. But the pulses, the light, the vibrations, they're all designed to test awareness, caution, and perhaps intention." They paused at the threshold, sensing the significance of the chamber beyond. The vibrations of the floor intensified subtly, as if responding to their hesitation. Elena adjusted her flashlight, shining directly into the narrow opening that led deeper. Shadows shifted across the far walls, creating an illusion of depth far greater than the actual distance. The metallic strands quivered in resonance, and a faint hiss of air exhaled from the passage, carrying the same mix of earth and metal scents that had accompanied them from the beginning. Marcus swallowed audibly, glancing at Elena. "It's responding," he said. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, but understanding comes first. Movement comes second. We proceed deliberately, or we learn nothing." Slowly, carefully, they stepped into the next chamber, aware that each motion, each sound, each beam of light was part of the delicate interplay, designed to detect and respond to intruders. The pulse of the floor and the violet glow seemed to welcome them forward, drawing them deeper into the underground network. Elena's mind worked rapidly, observing patterns, recording sequences, and anticipating the next reaction. Marcus, following her, tried to maintain calm but could not hide the tension in his posture. They were far beyond any ordinary discovery. What lay ahead was a continuation of an intricate system designed to challenge, to warn, and perhaps to conceal something ancient and important. The realization settled between them silently, as they moved with deliberate steps, entering the unknown, aware that one misstep could close opportunities forever. The pulse beneath their boots remained steady, a reminder that the structure itself was an active participant in their journey. Elena's fingers brushed a carved symbol near the doorway, sharper, fresher than the others, and she knew instinctively that they were approaching the point where hidden knowledge or danger would finally present itself. The chamber beyond promised answers, or at least further clues, and the air felt charged with expectancy. Each step forward was a measured decision, a dialogue with the space itself, and Elena felt the thrill of discovery mingled with the caution bred from centuries of unseen design. Together, they moved deeper into the heart of the structure, the violet light pulsing gently, the air vibrating with subtle intention, guiding them towards secrets long buried and deliberately concealed. The chamber ahead stretched farther than they had expected, its walls curving irregularly, as though the stone itself had been coaxed to grow around an unseen blueprint. Elena adjusted her flashlight to illuminate a shallow depression in the floor, noticing immediately that the grooves and metallic fragments formed a pattern that seemed to guide toward a distant alcove. The pulsing violet light increased subtly as they advanced, as if responding to their approach, reinforcing the sense that the chamber itself was aware of their presence. Marcus followed closely, his hand brushing lightly against the wall, feeling the faint tremors that accompanied each step. Every vibration and flash of light seemed deliberate, calculated to test their awareness. Elena crouched to examine a cluster of carvings along the floor, angular symbols repeated in sequences she had memorized from the tablets in the doorway, but here they were denser, more intricate, as if encoding not only instructions but perhaps history, warnings, or, she allowed herself the thought, names. Marcus leaned over to see, pointing to a series of grooves that intersected like a lattice. "Do you think it's a map?" he whispered. Elena considered the pattern, careful not to disturb the dust that had settled into the carvings. Not a map in the usual sense. More like a guide for behavior. How to approach, how to observe, perhaps even how to survive. The further they moved, the more evident it became that the chamber was divided into subtle sections, each marked by a pulse of violet light that corresponded with the arrangement of the metallic fragments. Small indentations in the walls suggested that objects had once been placed here, carefully aligned with the symbols on the floor. The thought struck Elena sharply. This wasn't merely a hidden chamber. It was a deliberate archive, a preservation of knowledge, or perhaps a ritual space of considerable importance. A sudden shift in the vibrations beneath their feet startled Marcus, causing him to stumble. Elena reached out, steadying him. "Careful," she said quietly. "The structure reacts to movement. Step deliberately." He nodded, swallowing. The air grew cooler, carrying a faint, acrid scent that suggested mineral deposits disturbed long ago, or perhaps some chemical residue preserved within the walls. Elena's flashlight caught a faint glimmer from the far alcove. She motioned for Marcus to follow her lead and moved closer. Shadows twisted along the walls, elongated and distorted by the flickering violet light, and the metallic strands lining the chamber twitched, responding subtly to their passage. As they approached the alcove, Elena noticed a slight depression in the floor, almost imperceptible, yet perfectly aligned with the grooves they had been following. She knelt to inspect it, brushing away centuries of dust and grime. Beneath her fingers, the stone was unnaturally smooth, suggesting frequent handling or careful design. A rectangular indentation appeared to match the size of the metallic disc they had found earlier. Elena picked it up and held it carefully, considering the sequence of symbols engraved on its surface. Placing it in the indentation produced an immediate reaction. The violet light pulsed rapidly, stronger than before, and the floor beneath them emitted a subtle hum, vibrating in resonance with the symbols. Marcus's eyes widened. "It worked," he whispered. Elena observed the alcove more closely. Tiny, almost invisible channels carved into the stone walls began to glow faintly, as if electricity or some other energy coursed through them, activating circuits they could not see. The symbols seemed to shift slightly under the light, revealing new angles and intersecting patterns previously obscured by centuries of darkness. "It's a lock," Elena murmured, "but not in the mechanical sense. A symbolic or energetic lock. The alignment of these discs and the sequence of steps opens it." Marcus glanced at her nervously. "And beyond it?" She did not respond immediately, focusing instead on the patterns that pulsed beneath her fingertips. The chamber had been designed to test attention, knowledge, and caution. Its creator, or creators, had intended that only those who observed carefully, who understood the significance of the symbols, would reach this point. Slowly, Elena adjusted the disc within the indentation, angling it slightly to match the pattern on the floor. The hum increased, resonating through the stone and up into their boots. A faint click echoed through the chamber, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. The wall in the alcove began to shift, a section sliding inward to reveal a narrow passage beyond. A rush of stale metallic air escaped, carrying the same acrid scent, but now tinged with something else, earth faintly sweet and decayed. Marcus stepped back, awestruck. "It opened," he whispered. Elena nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. The symbols, the vibrations, the pulses. They were all part of a system designed to conceal, protect, and perhaps instruct. Beyond this new passage lay further chambers, deeper secrets, and the likelihood of answers they could not yet fully comprehend. She studied the opening for a long moment, noting the careful alignment, the subtle reactions of the walls, and the faint glimmer of metallic fragments embedded within. "We proceed carefully," she said finally, voice steady, though her heart beat faster with anticipation. "Every step matters now. This is where the design reveals itself fully, where the knowledge or danger awaits." Marcus nodded, moving forward with cautious determination. The air from the passage beyond carried an energy that felt almost alive, brushing against their skin as they advanced. Each footfall drew a response from the walls and the floor, the pulsing light guiding them, warning them, challenging them to remain aware. Elena followed closely, scanning the symbols and patterns, piecing together the rhythm, the sequence, the intent behind the design. Every detail seemed deliberate, a record left by those who had come before, preserving a path for the careful and observant. They entered the passage, shadows stretching long behind them, the pulsing violet light now illuminating a faint outline of a larger chamber ahead. The vibrations increased subtly, syncing with the rhythm of the pulse under their boots. Elena felt a thrill of discovery tempered by caution, the sense that they were on the threshold of something monumental. A final glance back revealed the stone doorway still slightly open, its metallic disc slotting into the floor, maintaining the pulse, the warning, and the invitation. They had crossed the threshold, leaving the familiarity of the chamber behind and stepping into the unknown. And with every careful step, the anticipation of revelation deepened, the sense of being watched by the intent of the structure itself, both thrilling and unnerving. The path ahead promised answers, but it demanded focus, patience, and awareness, qualities that Elena now relied upon fully, knowing that the next discovery would challenge everything they had assumed. The passage ahead opened into a chamber far larger than any they had yet encountered, the walls curving upward to vanish into darkness that seemed almost alive, shifting imperceptibly as their eyes tried to focus. The violet pulse of light followed them, tracing along the floor and walls with the same rhythmic hum that had accompanied their every step. Elena stopped for a moment, allowing her senses to absorb the space. The chamber was irregular, yet its irregularity felt deliberate, as though the stone had been shaped to convey both containment and guidance. Marcus stepped beside her, his breathing audible in the silence, notebook poised but forgotten for the moment. Dust motes danced in the violet glow, catching fragments of reflected light from metallic shards embedded along the floor. They had begun to recognize the pattern, angular sequences echoing those on the tablets, now combined with a subtle topography, guiding their movement deeper into the structure. Elena crouched to study the grooves. Some were worn, others sharply defined, as if touched or activated repeatedly. She traced her gloved fingers along the sharp edges, noting that the wear was concentrated in one corner of the chamber. "It's as if someone or something has been practicing here," she murmured. Marcus leaned in, flashlight bouncing off the irregular walls. "Practicing what?" he asked, voice low. Elena did not answer immediately, her eyes scanning the distant far end where the chamber narrowed into a second passage. There was a faint glimmer there, not light, but a reflection, metallic, thin, deliberate. Her instincts screamed caution. The pulse of violet light quickened slightly as though acknowledging her unease. "Pay attention to the floor," she instructed. "Every movement has consequences." Marcus followed, moving carefully, each step producing subtle vibrations beneath their boots. Elena's gaze swept the walls and ceiling. Small notches, almost invisible at first, formed a sequence that aligned with the grooves and metallic shards below. They weren't merely decorative. They formed a multi-layered system of guidance and perhaps warning, designed for observation rather than for casual traversal. As they approached the narrow passage, Elena noticed a subtle change in the light. The violet glow had shifted, highlighting a low set of steps carved into the stone. Dust had settled in the treads, but there were faint scuff marks, small enough to be overlooked, yet deliberate. "Someone came this way," Marcus whispered, "but not long ago." Elena studied the marks carefully. They were shallow, precise, almost ceremonial in their regularity. "Not casual footsteps," she agreed. "A deliberate approach. Whoever made them knew exactly where to place their feet." They descended slowly, keeping the flashlight angled to reveal the faint metallic fragments set into the step edges. As each fragment caught the light, it reflected a subtle violet hue, reinforcing the pulse emanating from the floor below. Elena's fingers brushed along the wall, noting the energy of the space. It was as if the structure itself was aware of their intention, responding to their careful examination while ignoring careless intrusion. Marcus shivered. "It's unnerving," he said. "Almost like it's alive." Elena nodded. "Alive, yes, but in a manner that is deliberate, engineered, and precise. Think of it as a consciousness without mind, designed to respond to awareness and observation." At the bottom of the steps, they entered a smaller chamber, circular, with walls completely covered in metallic shards embedded at varying depths. The violet light pulsed more strongly here, reflecting off each fragment, producing faint patterns across the stone ceiling. Elena crouched to examine the floor. Here, the symbols were different. Angular sequences had been replaced by a web-like lattice of interconnected triangles and lines, each intersection carefully notched. Marcus knelt beside her. "It's like a puzzle," he whispered. "But what is the solution?" Elena studied the lattice, noting that some notches were worn deeper than others. "The solution is not something physical," she murmured. "It is observation, attention, awareness. The structure rewards those who notice patterns and respond deliberately." Her gaze moved to the far wall, where a faint shimmer suggested a shallow recess. She advanced slowly, flashlight revealing a small metallic plate set into the stone. Symbols on the plate matched those of the discs they had already encountered. She reached out to touch it, hesitating for a fraction of a second, and then pressed gently. The pulse intensified beneath their feet, vibrating in a rhythm that seemed to echo their own heartbeats. Marcus instinctively stepped back, notebook forgotten, as the far wall responded. A section of stone rotated inward, revealing a small cavity barely large enough to admit them. From within came a faint, almost imperceptible hiss of air, carrying the metallic, acrid scent that had been present since the first chamber, now mixed with a hint of something faintly sweet and decayed. "It's opening," Marcus breathed. Elena studied the cavity, noting its precise alignment with the lattice on the floor. "Yes, but carefully," she warned. Everything here is designed to test awareness, restraint, and observation. Move too quickly, and we could trigger unknown consequences." Marcus nodded, swallowing hard. Together, they stepped closer to the cavity. The pulse of the violet light increased, vibrating through their bodies, while the metallic shards on the walls shimmered faintly, casting moving reflections across the chamber. Elena's mind raced. Whoever had constructed this had intended it to endure, to challenge intruders over centuries, and to protect whatever lay beyond. And as they peered into the cavity, they glimpsed the faint outline of objects, metallic and patterned, waiting, silent, and deliberately concealed. The sense of anticipation was almost unbearable. Each step they had taken had led to this point, yet the chamber offered no immediate answers. Instead, it demanded patience, attention, and respect for the system they had entered. The pulse continued, vibrating in tune with the violet glow, and Elena realized that they had crossed into the true heart of the structure. Here, every vibration, every reflection, and every symbol mattered. And as she prepared to enter the cavity, she understood that the revelations awaiting them would challenge everything they had assumed about the purpose and intent of this hidden labyrinth. Elena peered into the cavity, her flashlight illuminating a small metallic pedestal at its center. The violet glow pulsed more rapidly here, resonating through the floor and walls, as if acknowledging their presence. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, glancing nervously at the intricate lattice on the chamber floor and the metallic shards embedded along the walls that shimmered faintly with each flicker of light. "It's beautiful," he whispered, though the awe in his voice was tinged with apprehension. Elena's eyes never left the pedestal. Its surface was covered in symbols identical to those etched throughout the labyrinth, but here they were arranged in a circular pattern, radiating outward like a celestial diagram. A thin layer of dust had settled over it, yet the grooves were sharply defined, suggesting that someone, or something, had carefully maintained this space over time. She stepped closer, mindful of the pulsing vibrations beneath her boots, and ran her gloved fingers lightly over the pedestal's edge. The carvings were precise, deliberate, almost hypnotic in their symmetry. Marcus leaned in, voice barely audible. "Do you think this is some sort of machine?" Elena considered the question. Mechanically, it made little sense. There were no moving parts, no obvious power source, and no indication that any conventional mechanism could operate it. Yet the pulsing light and vibrations suggested an interaction beyond the physical. "Perhaps not a machine," she replied thoughtfully. "Not in the way we understand machines, but it is designed to respond to those who approach with care, attention, and observation. Its purpose is interaction, not operation." She crouched to examine the symbols more closely. They were organized into concentric circles, each line intersecting the next at carefully calculated points. The outermost ring matched patterns they had encountered in the tunnels. Triangles, angular grooves, lattice intersections, all converging toward the center. Elena's mind raced. The construction of this pedestal, the deliberate pathways, the responsive pulses, they all suggested a system of encoding knowledge or preserving secrets. A faint metallic odor hung in the air, mingled with the stale scent of dust and stone. Marcus shifted uneasily, glancing at the pedestal. "So, this is the heart of it. Everything else led here." Elena nodded slowly. "It appears so. And what lies here may hold answers to questions we didn't even realize we were asking." She studied the grooves and noticed that the innermost circle of symbols differed slightly. They seemed fresher, less worn by centuries of dust. Someone had added them recently, or at least maintained them. Her pulse quickened. "Someone has been here not long ago," she murmured. "Perhaps the same individuals who left the discs, or perhaps someone aware of our progress, anticipating our arrival." Marcus swallowed hard. Do you think they knew we'd come? Elena straightened, glancing at him sharply. They might. Or perhaps the system itself is simply so sensitive, so attuned to awareness and observation, that it reacts naturally to any presence. She knelt beside the pedestal, angling her flashlight to illuminate the center circle. There, faintly etched and almost imperceptible, were markings that suggested movement, direction, and connection to the labyrinth outside. Elena realized with a jolt that the entire structure functioned as a cumulative record, a repository of instructions encoded in light, vibration, and symbol. It was as much a test of perception as it was a map of hidden knowledge. Marcus leaned closer, tracing a finger along one of the outer grooves. "It's like it's alive," he whispered, voice trembling. Elena allowed herself a faint nod. Not alive in a conventional sense, but in a manner designed to respond to human perception. Everything we have encountered here is interactive. We are not merely observing, we are engaging with it. She studied the central symbols again. There was a small recess, barely noticeable, carved with the same precision as the outer circles. Tentatively, she pressed a fingertip into it. The pedestal responded immediately. The pulsing violet light surged, reflecting off the metallic shards lining the walls, and a low, vibrating hum resonated beneath their feet. The lattice on the floor seemed to shimmer with a faint iridescence, guiding attention toward specific points. Marcus staggered back slightly, caught off guard by the intensity. "It's reacting to you," he said. Elena's focus remained unbroken. The vibrations, the light, the symbols, they were communicating, not mechanically but through deliberate stimulus. She realized with sudden clarity that the purpose of this chamber was not concealment alone. It was preservation, instruction, and perhaps revelation. The symbols told a story of intent, of knowledge meant to survive beyond human memory. Her mind raced, piecing together the sequences, recognizing repetitions, deviations, and intentional alignments. She felt the weight of centuries of design pressing against her awareness. The realization struck her with force. This was no ordinary discovery. What lay before them was a deliberately encoded message, a hidden system designed to interact with those capable of observation, reasoning, and patience. And in the center of the pedestal, the faintest glimmer suggested another layer, a secret waiting to be unlocked. Not with brute force, but with understanding. Marcus stepped closer again, hesitant but compelled by curiosity. Elena gestured for caution. "Observe first. Understand. The structure tests those who enter. Any action without comprehension could trigger consequences we cannot anticipate." She studied the shimmer at the very heart of the pedestal, realizing that the next movement would not merely advance them physically, but would initiate a deeper engagement with the design's purpose. The hum beneath their feet intensified, syncing with the pulse of violet light, signaling that the moment of revelation was imminent. Elena inhaled slowly, steadying herself, and prepared to interact with the final layer of symbols, understanding that what they discovered next would reshape everything they thought they knew about this hidden labyrinth. Elena took a deep, measured breath, steadying herself as she crouched over the central recess of the pedestal. The violet light pulsed rapidly, almost impatiently, reflecting off the metallic shards embedded along the walls, shimmering in patterns that seemed to communicate with her own heartbeat. Marcus remained just behind her, notebook abandoned, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. The symbols in the innermost circle were unlike any they had encountered. Finer, sharper, and arranged in a manner that suggested a final layer of interaction. Elena traced the carvings with a gloved fingertip, following the subtle variations in depth and orientation. A pattern emerged, a sequence that responded rhythmically to her touch, guiding her motions with imperceptible cues. She realized that the design was deliberate not only to test observation, but to communicate knowledge. Slowly, Carefully, she aligned her movements with the sequence suggested by the grooves. The violet glow intensified, illuminating the walls in a delicate lattice of reflections. Metallic shards shimmered with a resonance that was almost musical, vibrating subtly in response to her precision. Marcus watched, captivated, as the entire chamber seemed to come alive in synchronization with her actions. The hum beneath their feet strengthened, echoing in their chests like a distant drum. At the center of the pedestal, a panel slid open silently, revealing a compartment barely larger than a hand. Within lay a small, intricately carved object, metallic yet lighter than expected. Elena's fingers closed around it carefully. The moment she lifted it, the pulse of light shifted from violet to a faint golden hue, casting a calm, steady illumination across the chamber. She examined the object, a delicate, disc-shaped device etched with concentric rings of symbols and shallow grooves that radiated outward like ripples on water. The realization struck her suddenly. The disc was both a key and a record. It encoded the history, purpose, and perhaps the intended guardianship of the labyrinth. Marcus leaned closer, his voice hushed. "It's a message?" Elena nodded. "Yes, and more. It is a repository of intent and knowledge, deliberately concealed, yet waiting for someone attentive enough to uncover it." She turned the disc in her hands, letting the light reflect off the carefully etched grooves. As she did, a memory from earlier in their exploration surfaced. The faintly different marks in the central floor lattice, the subtle vibrations, the deliberate arrangement of metallic fragments. Everything aligned now, revealing a message encoded not merely in symbols, but in interaction, observation, and comprehension. Elena realized that the labyrinth was not a tomb, nor a trap designed solely for misfortune. It was a test, a legacy left behind to identify those capable of understanding, preserving, and perhaps continuing the knowledge it contained. Marcus exhaled, a shiver running through him. "So, we passed it." Elena allowed herself a faint smile, though her eyes remained serious. "We passed the first layer, but more importantly, we understand the intent. That is what the Creator demanded. Awareness, not mere intrusion." She replaced the disc carefully, then set it aside, her hands lingering over it for a moment longer. The chamber seemed to pulse gently in approval, the hum beneath their feet settling into a steady rhythm, almost serene. Marcus glanced at the pedestal, voice trembling with both reverence and relief. "What happens now?" Elena rose slowly, brushing dust from her gloves. "Now we take what we have learned, we record it, we preserve it, and we ensure that its purpose is respected. The labyrinth has revealed itself to us because it recognized our attention, patience, and restraint." She turned toward the narrow passage that led back through the chambers they had traversed. The violet light had dimmed slightly, replaced by a softer glow guiding them onward. Every step we took, every observation we made, was part of the test. The purpose was not to challenge us for amusement, but to see if we were capable of understanding without destroying. Marcus nodded, still overwhelmed by the experience. "And the labyrinth, it's essentially a guardian." Elena allowed herself a brief, knowing glance around the chamber. "Yes, a guardian and a teacher. It holds knowledge, history, and instruction for those who approach with respect and attention. That is its reason for existing." They moved carefully back through the corridor, retracing their steps, the pulse of light and vibration now accompanying them like a silent guide rather than a test. Elena observed the symbols and grooves again, noting their continuity, understanding for the first time how each section of the labyrinth built upon the previous. The smaller alcoves, the grooves, the metallic fragments. They were all part of a deliberate system, a network designed to record and communicate. As they reached the entrance of the original chamber, the violet glow faded to a soft, ambient light. Outside, the air smelled of earth and the faint sweetness of old stone, grounding them after the intense sensory engagement of the labyrinth. Marcus took a deep breath, glancing at Elena. "Do you think anyone else could have understood it?" Elena shook her head slowly. "Possibly, but only those who approach with the same care, the same patience, and the same attentiveness. Anything less, and the labyrinth would remain hidden or resist intrusion." She glanced back at the pedestal one final time, noting the subtle shimmer still reflecting off its metallic surface. Its purpose is not merely to protect, but to teach, and in that it has fulfilled its design. They stepped into the sunlight outside, the contrast almost overwhelming after the muted, pulsing glow of the subterranean chambers. Elena felt the weight of centuries of design and intent settle in her chest, not burdensome, but instructive. She knew that the discovery would demand careful documentation and reflection, but for now there was clarity, understanding, and a profound sense of accomplishment. Marcus exhaled, a mixture of relief and exhilaration escaping him. "We actually did it," he murmured. Elena allowed herself a small, serene smile, the kind that comes from fully grasping a carefully concealed truth. "Yes," she replied softly, "and in understanding, we honor the intent of those who came before." The labyrinth had not merely revealed its secrets, they had been guided to perceive them in full. And as they stood together in the cool, bright air of the open world, the pulse of its lessons lingered, a quiet echo of knowledge preserved, patience rewarded, and mysteries understood through observation, care, and insight.